I found Tally in a crate of frozen salvage when my daughter was still small enough to ride my shoulders, and for 30 years, I never thought past the obvious explanation. Some predator on some rock had laid an egg in a cargo container, and the cold had kept it alive until my hands warmed it. That was the story I told myself, and the ship let me believe it, because the ship needed beast keepers more than it needed the truth. The Far Verge has run for 6 generations now, hauling what was left of 3 drowned colonies through the black between stars that don't care if we live or die. We don't ask where we're going anymore. We ask if the recycler's holding and if the beast pens smell less than they did last week. That's the kind of ship this is. Tally hatched the size of a fist, all wet plates and a mouth too big for its body, and it imprinted on the first warm thing it found, which happened to be the inside of my coat. I fed it scraps from the galley and let it sleep curled against the boiler stack in the pens, and within 2 years, it had outgrown every housecat-sized predator I'd ever handled, and within 10, it had outgrown the door. By the time it was full-grown, it stood taller than the loading mechs, armored along the spine in plates the color of old ice, with a jaw that could take a man's arm off at the shoulder without slowing down. It never once turned that jaw on anyone aboard. It turned it on rust, on jammed bulkhead seals, on anything I pointed at and said the word for. Mostly, it just wanted to put its head under my arm and have me scratch the soft place behind its jaw ridge, which was absurd, watching something that size fold itself down like a pup to get at a man's hand. It picked up habits the way a child does, without meaning to. I limped on a bad knee some mornings, and for a year afterward Tally favored its own offside foreleg on the exact same mornings, until I caught it watching me to check it had the limp right. It learned to sit when I sat, to go still when I went still, to press its head against the small of my back whenever Wren cried as a girl, as if it could absorb the sound out of the air before it reached her. The crew used to joke that I'd raised the gentlest monster in 3 systems, and they weren't wrong, and they weren't entirely right either, because gentle wasn't quite the word for something built the way it was built. It was something closer to careful. It had decided, on its own, what its strength was for, long before anyone gave it an order about it. I should say now what I didn't know then. The cold places past the edge of the chart have their own people, and the people of the Frost Compact had been hunting refugee convoys like ours for longer than the Far Verge had existed. Not to kill us, killing was inefficient, but to harvest us, ship and cargo and crew, when the long elliptical hunting tide finally swung their fleets back around. And the way they made that easy was to plant something docile-looking in our path, generations ahead of the tide, something that would grow up trusted, grow up loved, grow up exactly where it could do the most good for them when the signal finally came. I didn't know any of that on the morning the Compact's Herald pod locked onto our hull plating with a sound like a fist closing. The captain's voice came over every speaker on the ship at once, flat and controlled, in the way that means a person is 1/2 second from screaming. "Unidentified vessel inbound," she said. "Compact configuration. All hands to stations. And under that, quieter. Just for the Beastkeeper channel. Dorn, get Tally secured." I was already in the pens. Tally was already awake, and that was the first wrong thing. It had been dead asleep against the boiler 10 minutes before. It stood with its head low and its plates standing up off its spine one by one, like something was walking up its back from the inside, and its eyes, which had always been the dull amber of banked coals, lit up cold blue, the exact blue of the markings on the Herald pod's hull when it finally came into view through the pen's one porthole. I understood, in that moment, faster than I wanted to, what it was that I had been holding for 30 years. A voice that wasn't mine, and wasn't Tally's, came out of Tally's throat, synthetic, layered, broadcasting on every frequency the ship's beast collars could pick up. "Compliance window open," it said. "Subdue the deck. Open all locks to the Harvest Authority." Tally's claws came down on the deck plating and left 4 furrows in metal rated to stop a hull breach. Its head swung toward the pen door, toward the corridor, toward every soul on this ship who'd ever scratched it behind the jaw ridge or slipped it a piece of ration bar under the table. I did not run. I want that understood, because everyone who's heard this story since has assumed I was brave, and I wasn't. I simply could not make my legs do anything but stand exactly where I'd stood for 30 years, in front of that animal, doing the one thing I knew how to do. "Easy now," I said. Same 2 words. Same voice I'd used over a frozen egg, over a fist-sized hatchling shivering against my ribs, over every storm and breach and bad jump this ship had survived in 3 decades. Easy now, Tally. I'm here. The blue light in its eyes flickered. The synthetic voice in its throat stuttered on a command it could not finish, like a man trying to speak through a held breath. For 3 full seconds, the only sound in that pen was the ship's hull groaning under the Herald pod's grapples, and Tally standing rigid between 2 voices, the order bred into every cell of its body, and a man scratching 10 years of dust off the back of his own hand. Then its head came down, not in surrender, in choice. It turned its skull until one cold-banked eye, no longer blue, found mine, and it made a sound I had heard exactly once before, the night it was sick as a hatchling, and certain it was dying. Then it put its whole armored weight against the pen door, and put itself between me and the corridor the boarding party was about to come through. They came through 20 minutes later, 6 compact harvesters in boarding plate, led by a thin, pale officer who introduced himself to no one, because he didn't expect to need to. He had built broods like Tally for 40 cycles. He had never once needed to say a word to a successful harvest host. They always did the opening themselves. He said something to Tally in his own clipped tongue, a command phrase, I'd guess, the same kind that had already failed in the pen. Tally answered him by taking the lead harvester's boarding rifle in its jaw and folding it, and the man holding it, against the corridor wall hard enough to crack the plating. I won't describe all of it. The far verge's corridor was built for cargo, narrow and full of bad sightlines, and Tally used every inch of it the way I had never once seen it move before. Not because I had raised a killer without knowing it, but because for 30 years I had also, without knowing it, raised the only soldier on this ship who had absolutely nothing to prove, and everything left to protect. The pale officer did not draw a weapon. He stood very still at the edge of the wrecked boarding party and watched the thing his own people had engineered choose, in front of him, in front of his surviving men, a frozen-handed beastkeeper, over 40 cycles of imperial design. There is no good face to make when that happens. He didn't find one. He gave the retreat order in a voice that had lost every bit of its clipped certainty, and the Herald pod released our hull and fell back into the dark without its harvest, without its brood, and, I'd guess, though I never asked, without much standing left among whoever it was he answered to. Tally let me look at its wounds after, sitting in the corridor with its head in my lap like it weighed nothing at all, though it took 4 of us to carry it back into the pens. The crew started calling that day the morning the ledger held, after an old joke I used to make, that I'd found Tally in a salvage ledger and never bothered to read the fine print. It became shorthand, on this ship, for anything that turned out to be more loyal than its paperwork ever promised. Wren is grown now, with a beast pen post of her own 3 decks over, and she tells the new keepers the same thing I told her when she was small enough to ride my shoulders. You don't tame anything that size. You give it somewhere warm to put its head, and then you let it decide, on its own, what it is willing to tear apart to keep that warmth safe. Tally still sleeps against the boiler stack some nights. It still fits under my arm, in the one place that matters, even though the rest of it could take the wall down without slowing.